Now that our pawn is set up and the environment is prepared, we need to develop a way for the user to interact with the scene using their motion controllers. We'll accomplish this by building functions in our parent pawn to set up custom input. Learn how to search for input mappings for a motion controller, use previously created enumerations to set the value of the key for player input, overriding events that are called at the end of the game, and finally testing this new input with our motion controllers. Let's jump right in. Start in BPP pawn and create a new function called create inputs. We're not going to add any logic to inside of this function because we want to make it unique to each child class. For example, in VR, it will set up based on which HMD is plugged in, while on PC, it will prepare a desktop, mouse, and keyboard environment. So let's comment that this is to be unique to child. Place this function into an input category. Let's create 2 more functions for our child classes to use. These will be used to set up our new action and axis inputs. I'll explain the difference in a bit. Let's call this new axis input. Remember that we are creating these blueprints to be flexible. Anything they set up will also be broken down at the end so that they can set up new options at the next begin, possibly with new values for new devices or modes. So these new input functions will have the option to create and remove. Drag off remove and create a branch. For us to make changes to the input settings, we need to get the aptly named input settings. From the input settings, search for remove axis mapping and add axis mapping. If remove is true, we will remove these settings from the input settings. Drag off key mapping and select make input axis key mapping. We're going to pass the axis name and the key as inputs to this function, but ignore the scale as we won't need it for how we'll be using it. Let's compile before moving on to the next function. Create another new function and name it new action input. We're going to set this one up with the same thinking as the previous function. The difference here, though, is that it provides more options for the action key mapping. You're of course free to take advantage of the alternative keys like Shift or Control, but we will have such minimal input that I'll ignore them. Compile again. Place these 2 new functions into the input category. Let's drag the create inputs function to be called at begin play and compile. Back in our BP VR pawn, click override and select create inputs so that it gets placed into the event graph. Create a new function that will handle the VR inputs. Call it create inputs based on HMD and place it into the category HMD vertical bar input. And while we're here, let's also place identify HMD in the HMD vertical bar setup category and drag the other 2 into that category as well. Inside of create inputs based on HMD, let's add that remove bool as an input to pass along to the functions we created earlier. I don't want this to become spaghetti, so let's create a local variable that we will use in this function. Name it remove underscore local. Let's use the sequence node again. Drag off the execution pin and search for our new action input. You can see the target is BPP pawn, and because this is a child of this class, we don't need to plug anything into the target input. Plug our remove local into the remove input. Also create a new axis input and plug in the remove local again. This is going to be where we set up our left-hand input. In a bit, we will do our right hand the same way, but let me show you an example of where to find the input mappings for use in Unreal. Other HMD manufacturers will reveal this info for you to find the same way. We had planned on using the trigger as the primary inputs on both hands. So we will search for the trigger and see that the key is called motion controller L or R trigger. So that's what I will enter into the key for action input. For axis input, I want to be sure that I select Motion Controller L Trigger Axis. I'll explain the difference shortly. Let's simply duplicate these and change the values to our right hand. Compile these changes. Before we put in the action name, let's go to our project settings and set these inputs up. Open Input and create two new mappings in both action and axis. Name the inputs L underscore trigger press and R underscore trigger press. Then in axis, name them L underscore trigger axis and R underscore trigger axis. Now with this setup in our project settings, they have been written into the INI files inside of our config folder and have become available to call inside of our blueprints. Let's put those identical input names into our function. I'm just going to copy and paste and compile. Back in the event graph, drag the create inputs based on HMD and plug it into the create inputs event. And when the game ends, we also wanted to remove these additions. We need to override the function that will be called when the game is shut down. Go to your Functions panel and select Override and click End Play. Duplicate the Create Events based on HMD function and hook it up to End Play with Remove set to True. Add a comment that these create and destroy input for user. Our inputs for VR are now set up, but it is only set up for use with the triggers. What if you or your end user wanted to rather use the grip or a face button or some other key for whichever HMD is plugged in? We can simply get our eHMD type variable, drag off the key input, and create a select node. Plug the enumeration into the index. Now we can create unique keys for whichever HMD is plugged in. So I'll make the Oculus play with the right trigger, the Vive to play with the right face button 1, the PSVR to play with the right grip, and if it is not one of these options, it will default to play with the trigger. And that's it. We could do this for every input that we've set up to provide a system that will select the input based on the HMD type. Back in the event graph, let's test this to make sure our inputs are being created. Detach the remove function after event end play. Open your project settings and you can see that all the values here are none. Now press play and then end the game. Back in the project settings, you will find new inputs have been placed in. Now go back to BPC VRPON, plug end play back in, and press play again, then quickly exit. If you check your project settings now, you will see them set back to none. This is exactly what we had planned to create. The last thing I want to do here, besides explain the difference between action and axis mapping, is to test the input to be certain that it is receiving data from the motion controllers that I'm using. Right-click in the event graph and search for the input events that we created inside of the project settings. While I'm creating these, let's talk about the difference between action mapping and axis mapping. It's very easy. An action mapping will be an on and off input, as in, when I press the key, pressed is called, and when I release it, released is called. Think of the example from the template. We can pick up an object, and then we can drop the object. Axis mapping cannot be used for every key. The spacebar, for example, is either pressed or not. But the triggers or thumbsticks or grips on our motion controllers or your gamepads can be not pressed, fully pressed, half pressed, a little bit pressed, and mostly pressed. Any amount of pressed between 0, as in not pressed, and 1, as in fully pressed. We can then use those values to do all sorts of things. But beware of memory usage with axis events. They are called every single frame to return what their current value is. Try to keep your memory footprint as small as possible. Let's test these inputs with some simple print strings. For the axis events, I don't want it printing every frame. So I'll tell it to only print if the axis value is greater than or equal to 0.1. And if it is, print the axis value. This is going to produce a lot of prints, but at least we'll know if it's working or not. Let's compile and press play. All right. We have left hand pressed and axis values are being printed, and the same with right hand. I love when things work. Let's quit the game and delete these print strings, but keep the branches on the axis events as that is how we'll limit those inputs. And compile. Okay, our VR pawn is now spawning correctly, and the first steps of interaction is set up. We used our previously created enumeration to create unique inputs based on HMD, overrode the function that is called on endPlay to clean up our newly created inputs, and we tested those new inputs. Next, we set up our game mode to correctly spawn the VR pawn when the game starts.